Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for what is a very timely, rapid response briefing hosted by the Institute of Global Politics and the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. We're going to be talking about the rapidly changing dynamic situation in the Israel and Iran conflict. And given how this situation has rapidly unfolded and escalated over the last week, this is likely going to be the first of several rapid response briefings on the topic that we will have over the next few weeks, where we're trying to bring together experts from the Center on Global Energy Policy, from SIPA and the Institute of Global Politics, as well as distinguished colleagues from our expanded network as we have today, to offer insights and perspectives on the current state of play of the conflict. We only have an hour to cover a lot of developments from the last week. And today we really have with us some of the most knowledgeable experts on Iran, Israel, the Middle East, and broader decision-making in times of crisis, as well as the geopolitics of the region and the world. So I want to dive in, but before I introduce our panelists, I'll just briefly set the stage a little bit. As I think most people watching this webinar no doubt know, just under a week ago on June 12th, the Israeli military conducted strikes targeting Iran's nuclear program and its senior military leadership. The attack and the subsequent retaliations by Iran have set off an exchange of missile strikes, targeted assassinations, sustained conflict between Iran and Israel. The backdrop for this has been Israel's concerns, which are shared by others in the global community, about Iran's pursuit of the development of nuclear weapons. Since the conflict's onset, escalations in fighting have raised concerns about the conflict's impact on global security, geopolitical instability, and of course, what we think about every day here where I'm sitting, global energy markets. Leaving us where we are today, with many around the world looking not just at what Israel and Iran will do, but looking at how other major powers, including the United States, China, Russia, the Gulf nations, may respond directly, and how they are weighing their options to engage as the conflict continues, while also raising many questions about how the fighting may impact the future of a new nuclear deal between Iran, the US, and other countries, something that the Trump administration has been focused on since the first Trump administration pulled out of the so-called Iran deal, the JCPOA, that we will talk about, or Richard was very involved in putting together. So with that, I want to quickly introduce our panelists today and then get right into the conversation. And it is a pleasure to welcome them all here. Eyal Hulada, Senior International Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a former Israeli National Security Advisor. Our own Richard Nephew here, a Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, also an Adjunct Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and a former U.S. Deputy Special Envoy for Iran. As I said, he's worked very closely on the JCPOA and prior negotiations between the U.S. and Iran dating back to when we first met in the Obama administration. My friend and frequent collaborator and co-author, Megan O'Sullivan, who is the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard and the Jean Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Elizabeth Saunders, a colleague here on the faculty, incoming director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at SIPA, professor of political science here at Columbia. I should say a very popular professor, and I know that because my daughter couldn't stop raving about taking her class last year. So Eyal, Richard, Megan, Elizabeth, it's great to have you here with us today. And before I ask maybe Richard to kick us off with a sort of high level, where are we at this moment? Things are changing pretty rapidly. Just want to encourage everyone to also use the Zoom Q&A function. If you have a question you'd like our panelists to answer in the last 15 or so minutes, we'll turn to questions from the audience, or if there's a particular topic that you want people to focus on that in 45 minutes we were not able to get to. So, Richard, you've been keeping all of your colleagues here at the center well informed at all hours of the day on the situation. Maybe you could just help everyone level set by helping everyone watching this understand high-level overview of where the situation stands today and what's the latest.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks very much for having me, and happy to join this group. So, I think I've got, six kind of main points that I'll lay out. First, as you mentioned, starting last week, Israel began conducting a series of attacks on significant nuclear regime, missile, and other facilities inside of Iran. Primary focus has been, stated by the Prime Minister to both prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, to prevent Iran from being able to attack its neighbors, including Israel, as well as to damage the regime's ability to cope with the crisis that's in place. And I think you can see that with some of the steps that were taken to target senior IRGC and military officials who would have been responsible for Iran's response on those early hours. Those attacks have followed what I think would have been a predicted pattern of being able to knock out significant numbers of Iranian missiles, key parts of the nuclear program, as well as to suppress Iran's ability to interdict and intercept both Israeli aircraft and, if the United States enters into the conflict, U.S. aircraft that would be operating over Iran. Such that I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before that, that Israel was able to say that they believe they have air superiority over Iran. The Iranians continue to retaliate and continue to launch missiles and drones towards Israel. In fact, just as we were going live, there is a air defense warning that has gone out across Israel. So there is an ongoing attack in Israel as we speak. Israeli forces have thus far been able to intercept most of the missiles that have been heading their way, including as well as drones, but they have not been able to intercept all. And there are some reports indicating that there may be interceptor shortages coming to bear. On the other hand, the number of Iranian missile volleys have also started to decrease, with the number of missiles in each volley also decreasing. So there is a little bit of math that's going into these attacks. While a couple of days ago, there were some attacks being made on energy-related infrastructure, both in Iran as well as in Israel, those attacks really haven't been repeated in the last 2 days. That doesn't mean that they won't come back and that those targets wouldn't be part of a future set list, but at least for a level setting, they aren't taking place in the last couple of days. On the issue of U.S. involvement, Donald Trump was asked repeatedly over the course of the last 24 hours whether or not the United States is going to enter into the conflict, and he continues to give very mixed, I would say indistinct answers, saying maybe we will, maybe we won't. I think that ultimately this comes down to a tension that exists about whether or not the United States and its involvement is required in order to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, particularly to deal with some of the deeply buried and hardened targets that U.S. Air Force capabilities are really only the best way of trying to deal with, especially the nuclear site at Fordo, contrasting with the president's very clear disinclination to get involved in future wars in the Middle East. And I think that tension continues to be manifest both in terms of the discussion here in the United States and in some of the comments made by the president. That doesn't mean the president has been silent on these issues. He's issued a number of very severe statements towards the Iranians, including at one point demanding their unconditional surrender. The Iranian response has also been quite severe rhetorically, threatening the United States if we were to enter into the conflict, including U.S. bases and U.S. service people operating in the region. And the Iranians have also made very clear that they would consider U.S. involvement to be a very significant change in the posture in the Middle East. Last big point to offer is that there may be some movement on the diplomatic side, although I would caution people to be a little bit skeptical. Reportedly, in the last couple of hours, the Iranians have finally provided a response to the U.S. Diplomatic proposal that was made during the last round of talks. According to press sources, it was a polite no, but presumably that included language that may, I emphasize may, give space for continued diplomatic contact, but there really is no further information at this point about what the details are and whether or not it would be remotely acceptable to Israel to halt the conflict at this point and to pursue instead a diplomatic outcome.
Thanks, Richard. Maybe, Elizabeth, I can come to you next to sort of add anything you want to what Richard said. And then in particular, sort of, he talked about how the U.S. is thinking right now, whether the U.S. comes into this conflict, and we've seen mixed signals or different signals from President Trump. What do you think is happening, and what goes into a decision like that for a president and his advisors?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. It's a pleasure to be in this distinguished group and try to make sense of these events. As Richard was speaking, I was realizing it has been less than a week, and it is, and so many other things have happened in that time period that we're not even talking about today. So it's a bit dizzying. I think a couple points just to kind of, I agree with everything Richard said. I don't think Trump has decided what he wants to do. He has this idea that he wants to play the madman, be unpredictable, and he did that in his first term. And there's a lot of evidence in political science research that madman behavior is not very effective, even if you pull it off skillfully. And I think at this point, it's hard to say that that can really be. I think in the end, everybody kind of knows that he's gonna do what he's gonna do, and what he says now may or may not have any bearing on what his ultimate decision will be. I think Richard has it exactly right that the tension is between his very strong inclination to stay out of Middle East wars. I would just add a slight tweak, which is that I do think he likes bombing things and people as a way of looking tough. And I don't doubt that that's part of the appeal of doing something like this. But I also think, a lot of people have raised the analogy of the Iraq War, but I keep going back to the North Korea crises of the first Trump administration when they kept talking about the bloody nose strategy, right? If you just hit them and give them a bloody nose, then they'll realize, and all of a sudden it'll be, they'll be ready to negotiate. And in the end, he didn't choose that option. And instead, what he really wanted was a summit and a photo op with Kim Jong-un. So, I do think that, it's reassuring an adversary, providing assurance that you will not threaten again is very hard, right? Coercion is about not just do what you have to, if you do this, do this or I will hit you. It's also, if you don't do it, I won't hit you. And that reassurance piece is often forgotten in discussions of coercion, but it's really important. And I keep coming back to this idea that, like, of all the American presidents, he cares about the optics almost above all else. So I would just say almost nothing would surprise me at this point about what Donald Trump would do, right? If he bombs it, I don't think I'd be surprised. If he chooses not to, I wouldn't be surprised. I also wouldn't be surprised if what he really is aiming for is a meeting with the Ayatollah. And, so I don't say that because I think he's a genius madman who's actively being unpredictable. The final point I'll just make is that part of the reason why I say this, and I'm not sure I would necessarily have said it in the first Trump administration, is that this administration, the second Trump administration, has almost no guardrails left. And that wasn't true in the first Trump administration. There were people who were around him who had their roots in the military establishment, Congress in many cases, and they provided some constraint on his most sort of aggressive instincts. And I don't think this time, I think right now, and I've just published a piece that suggests that we have effectively the foreign policy of a personalist dictatorship. There just isn't, Congress is not going to constrain him. Bureaucracy is not going to constrain him. His advisors aren't going to constrain him. So we are down to that basic tension. Does Donald Trump want to hit Iran and be tough, or does he want to just stay out of it and declare victory and stay home? So it's anybody's guess what will happen, but it's all going to come down to Trump.
Thanks. Your great comments make me think. I think somewhere behind me is Richard's great book on sanctions. I think one of the points there, Richard, is you need, when you design sanctions, not only to tell people what you don't want them to do, but make clear what you need them to do to see those policies lifted and changed, which I was thinking about as you were speaking. I have many follow-up questions, but I want to get all.
Well, can I just add one other thing, though, since you raised that question, I can't resist noting that this is a problem I've been teaching this problem for like 15 years. I'm sure everyone here has been teaching or working this problem forever. And one of my very first entrees into studying international relations was actually looking at the question of sanctions versus engagement with Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And I remember reading Megan O'Sullivan, right? So I raise this because this is a very old problem, and all presidents and bureaucrats and members of Congress and prior Israeli prime ministers, including Netanyahu, up to this point, have chosen to not use military force. So this time really is different. And it may not be that we get involved, the US gets involved militarily, but this is a really, really changed environment that we're in.
Megan, you were called out by name, so I'll let you respond. Would love to hear, again, kind of where you think we are. And in particular, I'm interested in sort of how you think about the option set of where we go from here, everything from regime change to a new Iran deal, and I want to come back to this question of how the U.S. might engage when we think facilities like Fordo are still there, still operational. Megan.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. Great to be with you as always, and great to be with this group. With Elizabeth saying that she read my book on a very, very old problem makes me feel very, very old. But anyway,
I said I've already been teaching it for 15 years, right? So we're
it's true. Yeah. It is an old book, but a very real problem now. So let me say, Jason, to your question, a few things about this diplomatic possibility that Richard suggested, the use of U.S. military force, and a little bit around that, and then I can say a bit about regime change, or we can leave it for later in the conversation. I would want to say that this is this conversation, I think, is reflective of a lot of conversations that a lot of us are having right now, which really are focusing on Donald Trump and on Israel. And that it's worth just, pointing out what I hope is obvious, but an important backdrop is that this particular crisis has been pushed to the forefront by the Iranians actually responding to failed efforts at diplomacy with ramping up their nuclear program. So it's their response. It's the IAEA's finding, after looking at a report over 6 months, they're finding just a couple of weeks ago that they could no longer say to the international community with confidence that Iran's program was a peaceful one. And then we saw a censure by the Board of Governors right before the morning, actually before Israel started military action, saying that basically Iran was in egregious violation of its duties to convince the world or make the world confident that it had a peaceful program. So again, there's just that's an important bit of context. In terms of the scenarios about where to go next, I think both Richard and Elizabeth have really, underscored the uncertainty. We are at a moment where many things could change with very significant consequences. On the diplomatic piece, my view is I share Richard's skepticism that this is the direction we're going to go. I still believe there is a possibility, and I believe it is likely to be, looking at the current option set, would be if Iran could be brought to an agreement that actually would be much more stringent even than the JCPOA. This would be the most desirable outcome. And that is because...
For whom? Sorry, just to be clear.
Most desirable outcome for the United States, for Israel, for the region and the world, probably not for the regime in Iran, but that's the least of my concerns. But it simply is, even if there is military force, which, may well be the necessary next step given where we are, but even military force will not be able to indefinitely remove the threat of Iran building a nuclear weapon. It can definitely set Iran back significantly, but it won't result in an outcome, almost certainly won't result in an outcome that involves international inspectors and a rigorous verification regime that could give us, some confidence that the world would be able to see if Iran reinitiates its efforts to pursue a nuclear weapon. So that's why I say that. How likely is it? Again, agree with Richard. Highly unlikely. There's 3 different actors here: Israel, Iran, the United States. I think this still might be Trump's preference. It would be a huge win for him, but also, he has very real divisions in his base about using military force. The question is, I think Richard mentioned the Israelis may not go for it. They don't appear to have a way to deal with Fordo. And so if the US says, this is the way we want to go, and we're not going to use military force to take care of Fordo, the Israelis are not in a strong position. The question is Iran. And the way that it has been presented, I don't think it increases the likelihood that Iran would really, what is going to look like a capitulation to most of the world, swallow and go for the kinds of restrictions that I think the Trump administration should be asking for, probably is asking for. It's severe limits on enrichment and a variety of other things. So again, this would be a good outcome. Unlikely. It would be a good outcome, assuming it's a very, very stringent deal that Iran would have to adhere to. I'll just say a little bit about military force and then hand it back to you, Jason, or others on the call. So here, I think Elizabeth points about what's motivating President Trump is certainly important in trying to figure out what might happen next. But I think, it is important to note that right now, we're sort of teetering on what I consider to be the worst case scenario, or a very bad scenario, in which the regime, for all the debate within the regime in Tehran about whether they should go all out and pursue a nuclear weapon, my guess is that debate is going to be very one-sided going forward. It seems like there's no question in the minds of Iranians that they should have a nuclear weapon. This would have never happened to them if they did. And right now, it appears that Israel doesn't have a plan to take care of Fordo. So Iran now has the increased desire and motivation to rush for a nuclear weapon, and it still has the capability. So this is not a good outcome. So either Fordo needs to be taken care of with a diplomatic track, as I just discussed, or it looks like the U.S. will come in and use military force to address that. Where that leads, I think, opens up another very, very complex set of questions. I mean, the U.S. could choose to go in and just bomb Fordo and say, that's it. Now come to the negotiating table again, a lot less on Iran's place to negotiate. The U.S. might say, okay, we're going to do Fordo, and we're also going to try to take out the various capabilities that Iran will have to retaliate, because I think you have to assume Iran is going to retaliate with whatever it has left, and that Israel has severely degraded Iran's military capacities, but those aren't necessarily the same ones as Iran might use against U.S. bases, Gulf states, and other things. So that's where I see the decision on military force and diplomacy. I'm happy if we want to come back to talk about this regime change question, which obviously looms large as well.
Eyal, there is a lot there for you to respond to, having been the Israeli National Security Advisor. Can you help everyone watching understand what Israeli leaders are thinking right now, what national security leaders are thinking? And you just heard a bunch of questions there, kind of, what is the outcome they are pursuing? What does success look like? And can that be achieved on issues like Fordo without the U.S. being part of that?
Yeah. So first, thank you, Jason, for having me, and SIPA. Speaking of context and time, Megan, I'm watching this the school behind you. I was a student there 15 years ago. One of my formative years, maybe leading the way that ended up in me being a national security advisor. And remember vividly your explanations about how things played out in Iraq in your time in the as an official. To go to the question, look, I mean, we can start this conversation with what might Trump do or not do, and how will he make the decision. I'm not sure this is where we should at least start it, and I think Megan touched upon the right thing. I think the first question to ask is why are we here? Why did this happen on June 12th? What has changed? And I want to cover this. Maybe people think that they know, but I think it is important because there are a few missing elements in the way that we analyze this. And this has been ramping up for a long period of time. And Israel, for years, have done whatever it could to delay the Iranian nuclear program and to prevent their capability with various ways to reach a nuclear weapon. You know, we don't have to go into the whole discussion of JCPOA, withdrawing from JCPOA, and why the Biden team were not able to go back to JCPOA. But when we are now in a point where in recent weeks and several months, there has been substantial change in the Iranian decision-making about not just their nuclear program, but about weaponization specifically. And you know, we always spoke about this. Richard, you remember this in conversation we had before. The U.S. has always tried to avoid defining tripwires. But tripwires are very important in decision making. This is also a thing that I was taught by Graham Ellison at the Kennedy School. Sometimes you need to know what has fundamentally changed in reality so that you know that you need to change your strategy and point of action. And for years, it was clear for Israel, for sure, that if Iran starts moving, dashing, creeping towards the bomb itself, something that they have refrained from doing from all the way from 2003, and also said that they will never do, right? But the archive taught us so much about what they have done until 2003 and gave us hints that allowed our intelligence to look more clearly about what they've been doing since. And once this start to change, and this is not just running the risk that Iran might decide to go for a bomb after an attack, but Iran actually started doing things that if we let them just the time will end up in a bomb. That's a significant change in Israeli calculus. I think it should be a significant change in American calculus, but again, I'm just talking from an Israeli perspective. All of this has been on the table in recent weeks and months between Jerusalem and Washington, and I'm sure that we will see more and more at it. I am cognizant that news media have been taking Tulsi Gabbard's hearing at the Senate back in March. Things have changed in March. And sometimes following the dots and making sure we're cognizant of changes is important. For Israel, it's very important. Why? Because the timing for Israel is different. And Israel's ability to wait and see what will happen later doesn't work the same way as the United States. Not just because we're closer to Iran, but because our measures are limited. And when your measures are limited, and sometimes you need to work with the things that you have. And this is why we're at this point. I think the significant aspect that have not been discussed enough over media about the things that Israel did, we can talk about Natanz, we definitely need to talk about Fordo, but we're skipping the aspect of what Israel did to the weaponization program itself. I think this was a loophole also in JCPOA. JCPOA only had this section T that really didn't touch upon enough. I thought, Richard, you may disagree, you can talk about this, but definitely as Iran is moving ahead, the ability to take out such a large number of experts, that those are the people who until 2003 made a lot of progress in their weaponization. Without them, it's very difficult for Iran to dash for a bomb. Taking out the facilities in which those scientists have been working, in Isfahan, in Tehran, in other places, will make it very difficult for Iran to dash to a bomb. And I'm saying this because, of course, I want to take out Fordo. And you know, I would be very surprised if this ends without even Israel doing something as meaningful as we can in Fordo. I'm not calling for the U.S. participation. I think this is an American interest, but it's for the Americans to decide what's the American interest. But even if we had taken out Fordo, there is so much enriched stockpile at 60%, 20%, and 3.5%. Iran, with the amount of advanced centrifuges that they have, could build a facility somewhere else, even if we've taken out Fordo and dashed to 90%. This is the risk that Israel found itself managing once we understand that the supreme leader is willing or has signaled to his people, start moving ahead toward a bomb, because this is the right thing I want in my posture vis-a-vis the Americans and all the rest. And this is why there's such a focus on the weaponization program, which we haven't seen before. We haven't seen in Israel planning in 2012, 2013, that most of you remember. Unfortunately, wasn't addressed by the various aspects because the IAEA is not allowed to touch weaponizations, because the Russians have never allowed to put any inspection on weaponization. Richard is smiling because he knows this to be true. Israel found itself in a position where we need to deal with that. I think this is the game changer. I think this is what will make it different in the future, or at least Israel hopes that this will make it different in the future, because if Iran cannot dash to a bomb, even if it wants to, we're in a different position. And now the question is, what options does that open? And I think the options were covered. I would personally definitely say I'm hopeful that in these conditions that Iran are at, the chances of getting to a good deal with the dismantlement that President Trump has agreed to, and you know what, even a real longer, stronger, broader agreement like President Biden spoke about in the previous administration, but I'm not sure had a strategy to reach it. Are we now able to bring something that close all paths of Iran to a nuclear program for an indefinite amount of time with good inspections and good capability? I know that it seems like Iran is now wouldn't agree to anything. I would be surprised if the team that went to Oman is not signaling to the Americans, we are willing to talk. Maybe not the talk that the Americans are wanting, but they're definitely in need to talk. I can talk later. I don't want to take all of the time about the Iranian situation. They're indeed in a very difficult position. They are alone. They're in solitude. The Russians did not come to their defense. The Chinese did not come to their defense. The web of proxies that they have built for years for this particular point in time, right? Hezbollah's sole reason was to deter Israel and to attack it should Israel attack Iran. Didn't participate almost at all. They are in solitude. It's not perfect, but Megan, if I may disagree, I think we're in a better situation than that. The Iranian ability to dash is not in their hands. Iranian ability to retaliate is way weaker than it was before. And now the question is, what do we do? And I will add, is this still just Israel's problem? Israel, I think, had to act because of the timing. And now the question is the entire world that also worries that Iran will get a bomb are going to do something or just leave it to us?
Thanks, Eyal. I'm going to come to Elizabeth in a minute and also Megan, but just quickly, Richard, I just want to see if you wanted to respond to any of that, because you had spent an enormous amount of time in your career pursuing a diplomatic solution, and I think we just heard a view that not just sanctions, but something like military force can be potentially an instrument to force a diplomatic solution, but also your understanding of what's happening in Iran now, how quickly they could and maybe are racing to get to a nuclear weapon. And just for people listening who probably at this point know, but when we talk about Natanz, talk about Fordo, just explain to people listening what those words mean and why they're important. And then let's talk about what we think is happening at Fordo and whether that's the sort of thing that there seems to be the sense that to deal with that from a military standpoint requires the US. And if Iran is racing toward so-called breakout there, you sort of put the US, are they boxed in? Like to prevent that, there's really nothing else to do if you can't get a deal other than a military option, whether the US likes it or not.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the U.S. has said for decades now that it is absolutely unacceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons and that we would take steps to try and address it. I think, previous administrations have worded that commitment differently, kind of each depending on their own, but it's been a persistent commitment, coming out of the United States. And I think this is part of the reason why, to some extent, yes, we may be boxed in at this point. But to some extent, we're also boxed in because this is a commitment we've made over a number of years. It's just more that the timing, to some extent, has been taking, out of our hands. I think that's both by virtue of what the Iranians have been doing, because I agree with Eyal. They've been making progress towards nuclear weapons for some time. One could reasonably characterize the production of highly enriched uranium that they've been doing for a while as a slow motion breakout. In fact, I've had that discussion with people before when I've said, I thought we had a year of breakout time under the JCPOA. And I said, yes, this is it. This is that time. We have been using that time. They have been moving towards that. But that's where the distinction between the production of HEU and weapons program kind of falls in, and where it's so tricky is one can have HEU and not have nuclear weapons. It does require different processes and different techniques and different technologies to do so. It is a different level of decision. Having HEU makes that all the more possible. And it's absolutely the case, has been made the argument many times recently. There aren't many countries in the world that have got both the HEU and don't have a weapons program. So it is a mess, really, in terms of trying to unpick what Iranian intentions are. And that's why you have to go with both what their technical capacities are and how you're able to stop it. We don't have to go through the whole history of the JCPOA, other than I will agree. I think the weaponization part of the JCPOA was one of the weaker pieces that was there. It was one of the things that we wanted to tune up as part of a longer and stronger deal that we were pursuing under the Biden administration. Part of the reason why we didn't get there, though, is because there was a sense that we couldn't commit and guarantee we would continue to implement a new nuclear deal that was reached, and that all goes back to the withdrawal. But I think that the most important point is kind of where we are here today. And the reality, I think, as Megan put it, Al put it, I think we need to get our heads wrapped around it. The Iranian decision-making now absolutely is going to be in furtherance of a nuclear weapons option that's much more real than it was. They're going to be looking at their security environment, seeing themselves much more vulnerable. And this is part of the reason why, even if you want a diplomatic outcome, as I do, I think the idea of ending the conflict now before you decisively dealt with the weapons side is dangerous. And until you have a clear sense of what a deal would look like and how you would get intrusive inspections and so forth. The big point I would say, though, is part of the difference, and the reason why you don't want to necessarily go to military action in the first instance, is I think it's intrinsically more difficult to make a deal work after conflict, after violence, after a lot of people have died, as opposed to beforehand. It makes it harder to convince people to cooperate fully. It's always going to make you much more skeptical of intentions. It's going to make you much more inclined to see failure to cooperate as indication of weapons intent. And candidly, we do have an example of that in the last 30 years in the case of Iraq in the 1990s. So I think as we look to potential diplomatic outcomes, we have to be very conscious of learning those lessons. You know, what does an inspection regime look like? How is it actually going to be monitored and implemented? Who is going to be responsible for that? How do we set the terms for when non-compliance are found? Bottom line, we may have entered a military scenario here, but the diplomatic task and what a deal might look like to finish this is not any easier than what it was beforehand. And in many ways, the actual use of force may have allowed the Iranians to hide material, hide centrifuges. It's going to make the work of the inspectors a little bit more difficult too. So it is a much more complicated environment, even if we can all agree that we now need to try and figure out a way of how that dismantle will work in a way that is mutually verifiable and builds confidence.
Elizabeth, can you just say a word about putting this in the broader context of what's happening in the region right now with Hezbollah, with the fall of Assad, with October 7th, and the war in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add, I think what Eyal raised is very, very important, and I think, but doesn't go far enough back, right? I mean, I think this is not the Middle East of 2003. It's not the Middle East of any really before October 7th, 2023, right? And Hamas in Gaza is the actor that started that process, but Israel's response has really been the thing that has reshaped it, right? So first you had the ongoing war in Gaza, which seemingly has no solution that I can think of. And I think a lot of that, I mean, the geography of this region is just punishing, right? I always tell this in the class where I taught Jason's daughter, I always would tell them, like, don't underestimate the just power of geography in getting in the way of what seems like the logical solution, right? And Gaza is probably the world's most geographically difficult place, I would say, for this kind of solution. But then, as Eyal raised, the Israel degrading Hezbollah to the degree that it decided to say, no, thank you, we're not going to help the Iranians who invented us, is kind of, that's stunning. The fall of Assad was stunning. And of course, Iraq is not the Iraq that even, during the U.S. presence, when I would teach the idea of, like, what would it take to hit the Iranian nuclear program over the last 15 years, it was always like, what are the flight paths and what are the politics of those flight paths? And, so much has changed since October 7th that those slides aren't going to work when I teach it the next time. So, which is of course really the only thing that matters, but I think it's hard to wrap your head around what this represents is not just hitting the Iranian nuclear program. It's a fundamental reshaping of the geopolitical balance, the balance power within the Middle East. It probably has lots of knock-on effects we won't have time to get into in terms of, pivoting the fabled pivot to Asia. We've unpivoted now several times, and we unpivoted this week again, bringing all these assets back to the Middle East. And that's not just Trump. President after president has wanted to do that, right? So, but I think the net of it is that Israel is now seen, and the New York Times had a very good article about this from the perspective of the Gulf states this morning, or maybe yesterday evening, Israel is now kind of the actor that, for, is seen as the one taking aggressive moves, even though it's absolutely true that it's the Iranian nuclear program that led us to this point, right? So I say that not to cast blame, but to just, if you look at the just looking at it from sort of a realist, where is the balance of power in the Middle East? It's hard to see that there's any real balance there. And the last thing I'll just say is, I'm just really struck as we talk about this and as I watch news coverage of it in such a compressed time frame. It's not just the Iranians that are alone. This sort of feels a little bit like it's Trump and Netanyahu on their own, right? There's no talk of a coalition of the willing. There's no talk of the UN. And I don't say that because I think multilateralism is important for multilateralism's sake, but it's just, again, it's quite a contrast, even from the run up to the Iraq war, right? It's just whatever, Netanyahu's government, which is on a knife edge, and I don't think we can leave the domestic politics of Israel out of this, launch this war, which may be of strategic necessity, but, nonetheless, and it's Donald Trump in the White House. And I find that sort of breathtaking, as someone who studies leaders in international politics and didn't think that leaders mattered quite this much.
Megan, you wanted to come in. I have lots of questions for you, but there was a couple of things maybe in particular you wanted to respond to. So let me just turn it to you.
I have so many things I want to respond to. Let me try to do it quickly, but I appreciate the intelligence of this conversation. First, just on Elizabeth's point, I've actually found it interesting on the multilateral thing. This, of course, is about three actors right now, but it's interesting. If you looked at the Chancellor of Germany, Merz came out with a statement that essentially was supportive of what Israel's doing, saying Israel's doing the dirty work for all of us. Those were his words. And that means that this is in the interest of a larger group than simply Israel. And, Israel's the one that's doing it and bearing the consequences of it. So I think it's interesting that the lines are not shaping up the same as the Gaza war lines. This is a different kind of dynamic. A couple of things that I think are useful for your listeners, Jason. I wasn't saying that Iran is now about to dash for a weapon. I do think, as Ayal mentioned, there have been ways in which their ability to do this has been degraded. The uranium conversion facility in Isfahan, these things will slow it down, but not, it will not drive it away from the fundamental objective. So I think that's why, having intrusive verifications and is going to be important to a more sustainable approach. In terms of the U.S. being boxed in, I won't spend a long time on this, except to say this is going to be the subject of endless inquiries and long stories in the Atlantic and PhD theses about, the dynamic between Netanyahu and Trump, and did Netanyahu basically force Trump into this? I think one thing that does seem pretty notable right now is that Israel did move to military action while there was an ongoing negotiation that people still felt had some legs to it. And that, I think, will be important as we suss out, who gets the credit, who gets the blame, depending on the outcome here. Finally, I would say in terms of, maybe I'll say something about regime changes because it is so critical, although Ayal, I'd love your view as well. Here, I think, we saw from Trump a tweet about the supreme leader saying, don't worry, we know where he is, but we're not going to try to eliminate him. I think he was simply trying to suggest this could get worse. Don't retaliate against the United States. I don't think there's much hope that would play out, that the U.S. would get involved and there wouldn't be any reaction from Iran. I think that the risk here, and Ayal, I'd really like your views on this because Israeli politics far better than I ever will. But the risk is that there is just a certain amount of confidence that comes in. The U.S. comes in, bombs Fordo, the Iranian regime really on the back foot. We've seen this in multiple conflicts. The surge to go for, a decapitation of the regime, I imagine will be strong in Israeli politics. But, and I think that'll be determinative. My guess is this won't be something the U.S. is pressing for. And if the U.S., the government were to be wise once it decides to use military force, hopefully it would use this, a major strike against Fordo as an opportunity to really, put the lid on this and stabilize the situation. But, I'd be really interested in Ayal's views on where the regime change conversation could go.
We have some questions from the audience I'll come to in a minute, but Ayal, you please respond to that.
Yeah, so I'll respond. So a few things about that, and maybe also on things that were said before. If Israel wanted to take out the supreme leader or any of the other civilian leadership of Iran, we could have done it in the first night when we decided to target very precisely with so few collateral damage in a way that I take pride on, because I used to serve in that organization. And every time we're able to do exactly what is needed and not to cause damage to others, I think we should also get credit for that, but that's a side note. But we decided to go after nuclear scientists and leaders of the military that were either responsible for damage before and definitely will be responsible for the retaliation. And you haven't seen not the supreme leader and not any of the civilian aides. That says for a lot about where Israel was, and I think still is, in its priorities and the way that we've crafted the objectives of a military campaign. This is a military campaign, and it has military objectives attached to it. I think the message that also given from Israel, the Iranian retaliation is not on military targets. The retaliation of the Iranians is on Israel's heavily populated civilian areas in Tel Aviv and in Haifa and all the rest. And if Israel did not have the air defenses that we do, and we wouldn't have invested so much money over the years to build individual safe rooms in literally every apartment possible, then maybe thousands of Israelis would have died from the barrage of about 400 ballistic missiles, each with a warhead of about a ton of warhead, right? No one has seen what Israel is seeing at the moment. And this still hasn't brought us to go after the supreme leader and everything else. And Megan, I'm saying this because I think it's important to understand the mindset, at least from an Israeli perspective. Can it get to that? It might. But this is also in the Iranian side. Israel has already signaled very lightly what we can do, even though the Iranians should know what we can do. And we'll need to see how this plays out. The second thing I want to respond to this has a lot to do with also the American position. It's true that Israel acted while there was negotiation, that some people believe that it was going somewhere. But I think it's quite obvious to say that if President Trump did not want Israel to strike on June 12th, Israel would not have struck on June 12th. When President Trump did not want Benjamin Netanyahu to strike on April 15th and 28th and others, Israel didn't. And when it was important for President Trump to wait. Now, again, I agree that many pieces will be written in Atlantic and PhDs, but we know the dynamics. I've been there. You've been there over time. Sometimes for Israel, it's just two answers, especially when it's binary, right? When you go for a military strike, it's either go or don't go. When Prime Minister Olmert asked President Bush about the reactor in Syria, President Bush said, well, we won't do it. I'll never know what exact wording were, but what Olmert understood was, I can go for it, and the Americans will be at least on my side. And I think this is what we understood right now, and this is important message. And I think that as long as President Trump is hoping to shape this in a way that would deliver a negotiated outcome, which I support, I think that this is the dynamics that we will see. Having said all of that, I won't, and I'm sure that neither of the people on screen right now, maybe most of the audience, will not shed a tear if Iran ceases to be ruled by this ruthless regime that is revolutionary, that has been not only oppressing its own people, but trying to tear up the entire Middle East for decades and decades and decades. That doesn't mean that this needs to be the military objective of Israel. To the best of my knowledge, it's not. If I was National Security Advisor, I would definitely advise this is not a military objective for this campaign. But this will not be an undesired outcome. Let's just be fair to say this. They are the bad guys in this story.
I want to bring in as many questions as we can in just a limited time left, and want to thank all of you for submitting your questions over the course of the conversation, and many, even more, who submitted them in advance, ahead of time. So I'll just try to pull in a couple. One of them I can't help but ask, which is this, everything we've been talking about matters in so many ways for security in the region, potential loss of life, conflict, global economy in terms of energy. And there are a couple of questions about the impact on energy markets. Maybe Megan, I'll ask you, and also Richard. In many ways, sort of striking that we just had the conversation we did, attacks, not just a one-off, but continuing to escalate, talk of much more significant escalation. And oil prices are about $75 today. They haven't soared to triple digits. There seems to be a sense that it's not going to go there and won't majorly disrupt energy markets with. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the Strait of Hormuz and what Iran might do there, potential scenarios for escalation. I think it's fair to say, not to answer my own question, but it seems like what I see happening, I think, are both Israel and Iran targeting energy in ways that impose pain on the other, without trying to escalate this and expand it much more globally. So refineries, natural gas, but not Karg Island or the Strait of Hormuz or the attack on Abqaiq and these global facilities. And I'm just wondering if you see that the same way, and how you think about the steps that might unfold in the days and weeks to come, and whether they could expand in a significant way that would impact energy. Maybe Megan and then Richard.
Sure, fantastic. I'm surprised that we're getting to this so late in the hour. I'm eager to hear Richard's comments and the comments of others too. I would say it is very interesting that here we are in the middle of a war that people have been anticipating, fearing for, a dozen years, more, 2 decades, and we still have relatively calm oil markets. How I would explain that very briefly, and then what might happen next, how I would explain that is a lot to do with what happened in 2019 when Iran struck Abqaiq and some Saudi oil infrastructure and a few other things that people really thought, oh, we're taking 5% of global oil production offline. This is going to result in massive turmoil in the oil markets. And it really didn't, for a variety of reasons that probably everyone on this call knows and we don't have to go into. And it didn't result in that major spike in prices. And so I think what we have is a market that's basically saying, show me the money, or, show me the supply disruption. And when that happens, I'm going to respond to it. But until it happens, I'm not going to respond to it. And so this, I think, is, it's interesting. It's fascinating. It also is potentially dangerous, just in the sense that, we're not preparing for it. Think about what happened before Libya, and this could turn out, something like Libya. But we had the Saudis agree to put more barrels of oil on the market before the military operation, and there's no indication that that's in the work. And I think the Saudis and others are saying in this market, we're not going to do that until we really see Iran's oil being taken off the market or some other larger kind of supply disruption. So I'll stop there just to say what could happen next. I think there's a real possibility that we get back into energy infrastructure if the United States becomes more militarily involved. I think that it may not be the first way that Iran retaliates on energy infrastructure. That may be U.S. bases in the Gulf, or through militias proxies in the Gulf on those bases. But I imagine we get into a little bit of a tit for tat in the energy infrastructure, and Gulf allies, kind of come in there relatively quickly. So I would be very surprised if this ends with U.S. military force on Fordo and no disruption of any kinds of supply. But Richard, love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with basically everything you had to say, Megan. I think that all matches my own assessments here too. I'll add just 2 kind of maybe minor modifications or additions here too. I think the other place in which the Iranians potentially decide to start attacking infrastructure is if they come to believe that the intent is to topple the regime, and they start running into a use it or lose it scenario. where they believe that they have to escalate to de-escalate, all these buzzwords that always are talked about. And so their theory is this will be coercive enough on Trump, it'll be coercive enough on Arab states to apply coercion on Trump, or Europeans and others. And so I can see a world in which this conflict is continuing for some period of time, and the Iranians look at their missile arsenal and they look at their capabilities, and they don't have many other options to try and impose meaningful costs on the rest of us. And that's the tactic that they choose to go down. The other piece that I'll just say is, again, accidents also do happen, especially when you're trying to engage in these sorts of spaces. So does misperception. And so, the possibility of an accident or some sort of mistake, or an IRGC officer loses, connection to Tehran and they decide to take their own initiative. All of these things are also a possibility, especially when you have the IRGC Navy having planned for years to try and interfere with shipping going through the Strait. So while right now I think the markets are kind of looking at the past and saying, I think we'll be all right, I think they need to be building a little bit more risk premium and sense that things could actually change, and in a way that's much less easy for anyone to control.
And I think those comments, if I'm right, were kind of, about these broader impacts, which tends to be more about oil markets. It's worth noting that natural gas can have important regional impacts. And when Israel temporarily shuts down a field, that can affect Egypt. If you hit Iranian gas infrastructure, that can affect Turkey and Iraq, and actually have sizable impacts that can be challenging for those countries to deal with. I'll open it up. Whoever wants to answer this, there's a question about how folks should, in terms of how the U.S. might respond, interpret Trump's posting to evacuate Tehran. How do people, I can call on someone, but if somebody wants to take that one, just jump in. Elizabeth.
I was trying to explain this to my young daughter the other night, that diplomatic speak is typically very bland and sounds kind of overworked for a reason. And, those kinds of statements from, president's words, they really do matter. They still matter. And that he's doing this on an insecure phone with no staff work is, to me, one of the more alarming aspects of this crisis, and it's just not responsible. And not
sorry, there's just a minute left, but Eyal, there's also a question about sort of how people should think about the impact of domestic politics in Israel on how Israel is approaching this right now.
Yeah. Well, that's a question I get a lot, and I always start by saying that I was National Security Advisor to the government that is the complete political opposite of this government. And if Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted me as a National Security Advisor, maybe I'll still be there. I'm not who he chose, and that's fine, of course. I think the issue of Iran is something that for years have been the least controversial politically in the Israeli sphere. Why? Because this indeed is the only threat that could become existential to us. And this question of when and how we should act is serious. The government I served for as National Security Advisor has invested billions to prepare and to create the arsenal that is now used in this war. Arguably, if we hadn't done so, Israel couldn't have done what it did in October and right now. And this was because that government knew just as much that we need to be ready for this moment. And you see Naftali Bennett, previous Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, previous Prime Minister, Gantz, previous Minister of Defense, Lieberman, previous Minister of Finance, all supporting this because this is an issue that Israel views this as something that is strong. That doesn't mean that there are not political aspects. Netanyahu survived the collapse of his government last week. Okay. I think we as Israelis, and this is something that I take pride of, in times of crisis, we tend to come together. Sometimes there is a political toll to it, right? And many of those political appointments, Yair Lapid said it in his, wrote it in his article. I'm the political opponent of Netanyahu, and I still support him because this is the right thing to do. Maybe this will cost him the elections, maybe. And I think you find us coming together. This is the way I think we should look at it. Doesn't mean that there aren't other aspects, and Netanyahu doesn't have other hidden interests. But I think at the core of things, this action happened because this was the time to do this, and they had the conditions that allowed to do this, with the support of an administration that is allowing this to take place. And then, politics will kick in. The war will end, and politics will kick in again.
thanks to all of you, Eyal, Richard, Megan, Elizabeth, for sharing your thoughts and your insights on this rapidly moving situation and following it so closely, helping us follow it so closely. I want to remind everyone watching here that we're planning for this to be the first in a series focused on the Israel and Iran conflict. Would encourage you all to keep an eye out for our next webinar on this rapidly evolving topic, most likely next week. But this was very timely. I learned a lot and want to thank you all for joining today. Have a wonderful day.